The line at First National Bank moved slowly that Tuesday afternoon. Lynn stood patiently, clutching her paycheck and ID card. After 10 years as a customer at this branch, she recognized most of the staff, though today there was a new face behind the third window. When her turn finally came, Lynn approached the counter with a smile. "Good afternoon," she said, sliding her paycheck and driver's license across the counter. "I'd like to deposit this, please." The young teller, whose name tag read Tyler, barely glanced at her before picking up the check. His eyebrows shot up as he examined it. "This is a pretty large amount," he said, his voice much louder than necessary. Several people in line looked up. "Where did you get this?" Lynn felt heat rise to her cheeks. "It's my quarterly bonus from work. I'm a financial analyst at Marshall Group." She kept her voice low, hoping the teller would match her tone. He didn't. "We'll need to verify this. It seems unusual for your account." Tyler held the check up to the light, turning it over several times. Lynn shifted uncomfortably. "I've deposited similar checks before. My regular teller never had any issues." "Well, I'm not your regular teller, am I?" Tyler replied with a smirk. "And we have procedures to follow." By now, everyone in the bank was watching. An elderly man behind Lynn had stepped back, as if whatever was happening might be contagious. A woman with a child whispered something, eyes darting to Lynn and back to the teller. "Could you please speak more quietly?" Lynn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's really no problem with the check." Tyler ignored her request. "I'll need to get my manager to approve this," he announced, stepping away from his window without lowering his voice. "Please wait here." Lynn stood alone at the counter, feeling dozens of eyes on her back. 3 minutes passed. 5. 10. Other customers were called to different windows, processed quickly, and left with no questions. A businessman who came in after her deposited what looked like a much larger check with no scrutiny at all. After 15 minutes, Tyler returned with an older woman in a navy suit. "Ms. Chen," the manager said, not bothering to introduce herself, "we need to take extra precautions with large deposits. Bank policy." "I understand that," Lynn replied, trying to keep her voice steady, "but I've been banking here for 10 years. I deposit my bonus checks regularly. This has never happened before." The manager's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps you usually come when your friend is working. Janice tends to be a bit lax with procedures." The implication stung. Janice, an older black woman who usually handled Lynn's transactions, was known for her thoroughness and professionalism. "Could we discuss this somewhere private?" Lynn asked, noticing a young couple whispering and looking in her direction. "I'm afraid we'll need to verify the issuing company," the manager continued, ignoring Lynn's request. "Please take a seat in the waiting area while we make some calls." Lynn glanced at her watch. She had a meeting in 40 minutes. "How long will this take?" "As long as necessary," the manager replied curtly. "Security is our priority." As Lynn moved to the waiting area, she caught sight of herself in the reflection of a glass door, standing tall in her charcoal suit, briefcase in hand, every bit the professional she was. Yet here, in her own bank, she was being treated like a potential criminal. For 45 minutes, Lynn sat in the hard plastic chair, watching other customers come and go. Some avoided looking at her. Others stared openly, curiosity and suspicion in their eyes. With each passing minute, her humiliation deepened. When the manager finally returned, she handed back the check and ID without apology. "Everything seems to be in order. Tyler will process your deposit now." Lynn rose slowly, her legs stiff from sitting so long. As she walked back to the counter, she noticed something she hadn't before. Of all the customers who'd come through while she waited, she was the only Asian woman. And she was the only one who'd been questioned. That night, instead of letting the humiliation fade, Lynn opened her laptop. "This isn't right," she whispered to herself as she began to type. "And it's not just happening to me." Little did the bank know, their actions that day had lit a spark that would soon become a flame of change. Lynn couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the other bank customers staring at her. The memory of standing at that counter, being treated like a criminal, kept replaying in her mind. The next morning at work, she stared blankly at her computer screen. Numbers and charts that usually made perfect sense to her now seemed meaningless. She'd missed 2 calls from her team leader and hadn't even noticed. "Hey, you okay?" her co-worker Rage asked, tapping gently on her cubicle wall. "You've been looking at that same spreadsheet for an hour." Lynn forced a smile. "Just tired. Didn't sleep well." But it wasn't just tiredness. It was something deeper, a feeling of being small, of being other despite all her hard work, her education, her decade of loyalty to that bank. At lunch, she couldn't eat. Instead, she pulled out her phone and typed a formal complaint to First National Bank. She described every detail, the loud questioning, the long wait, how other customers were processed quickly while she was singled out. Her fingers trembled slightly as she hit send, but it felt good to take action. 3 days passed, no response from the bank. On the 4th day, while waiting for her morning coffee, Lynn overheard 2 women talking. And then they made her wait for nearly an hour, just to catch her own paycheck. One woman was saying. Lynn turned around slowly. The woman speaking was middle-aged with gray-streaked hair. She wasn't talking about Lynn, she was describing something that happened to her niece. "Excuse me," Lynn said, her heart pounding. "Was this at First National on Main Street?" The woman looked surprised but nodded. "Yes. How did you know?" "Because almost the exact same thing happened to me last week." They moved to a table, coffee forgotten. The woman's niece was a college student who'd received a check from her grandmother. Despite having proper ID and an account at the bank, she'd been questioned loudly and made to wait while verification was done. She was so embarrassed she closed her account the next day, the woman said. It was her first bank account ever, and now she's afraid to use banks at all. That night, Lynn couldn't stop thinking about the conversation. On a hunch, she typed "humiliated at bank" into a search engine. The results shocked her. Pages and pages of stories appeared. People from all backgrounds sharing similar experiences, being questioned loudly about their checks or deposits, having to provide extra identification, being made to wait while others moved through quickly. Many stories came from women, immigrants, and people of color. Lynn started taking notes, organizing the stories by location, bank, and circumstances. Her analyst brain kicked in, looking for patterns. She created a spreadsheet, then another. By midnight, she had documented over 200 incidents across the country. The next day, she was late for work, something that had never happened before. Her team leader looked concerned when she rushed in. "Everything all right?" he asked. "Actually, no," Lynn replied. "But I think I might be able to help fix something important." During her lunch break, she called the State Banking Commission. The representative listened politely but didn't seem surprised. "We get complaints like this sometimes," he said, "but unless there's clear evidence of policy violations, there's not much we can do." "What would count as clear evidence?" Lynn asked. "Well, documentation of systematic problems, not just isolated incidents. Statistics showing patterns of discriminatory treatment, that kind of thing." Lynn looked down at her spreadsheets. And if someone provided that? After work, she stopped at a community center near her apartment. A poster advertising "Know Your Financial Rights" caught her eye. The workshop had already happened, but a contact email was listed. That evening, she wrote to the workshop organizer, describing what had happened to her and what she'd discovered since. She didn't expect a reply right away, but her inbox pinged just 20 minutes later. "This is exactly what our organization has been tracking," the reply read. "Would you be willing to meet and share your data?" Lynn sat back in her chair, a strange mix of emotions washing over her. The humiliation of that day at the bank was still there, but now there was something else too, a sense of purpose, of movement forward. Her phone buzzed with an email notification. First National Bank had finally responded to her complaint. "We apologize for any inconvenience. Our staff follows standard verification procedures for all customers. We value your business." Lynn read the generic response twice, then looked back at her computer screen filled with hundreds of similar stories. "Standard procedures for all customers," she whispered to herself. "Let's see about that." She opened a new document and began typing a response, not just to the bank, but to everyone who needed to hear it. This wasn't just about one bad day anymore. It was about changing the rules of a game that had been unfair for far too long. The coffee shop was crowded when Lynn arrived. She spotted the woman immediately. Tall, with silver-streaked hair, pulled back in a neat bun, waving from a corner table. This was Dr. Patel, the financial rights workshop organizer who had responded to Lynn's email. "Thank you for meeting me," Lynn said, sliding into the chair across from her. She pulled out her laptop, hands slightly shaky with nervousness. "No, thank you," Dr. Patel replied. "We've been trying to document these banking incidents for years, but people are often too embarrassed to come forward." Lynn opened her spreadsheets. "I'm not sure if this will help, but here's what I've found so far." Dr. Patel's eyes widened as she examined Lynn's work. "This is incredible. You've organized everything by location, bank branch, customer demographics, type of transaction. How long did this take you?" "A few late nights," Lynn admitted. "I'm an analyst by training. Numbers and patterns are what I do." "What you've done," Dr. Patel said, leaning forward, "is create the first statistical evidence I've seen that these aren't isolated incidents. This could change everything." For the next hour, they compared notes. Dr. Patel's organization had collected about 50 first-hand accounts of discriminatory treatment at banks. Combined with Lynn's research, they now had over 250 documented cases. "The patterns are clear," Lynn said, pointing to her screen. "Look at the verification protocols. Customers who are people of color, women, or have accents face additional scrutiny 73% more often than others. And the wait times, on average, 42 minutes longer." Dr. Patel nodded grimly. "What about economic impact? Have you looked at that?" Lynn hadn't, but the question sparked something in her. That night, she dove deeper. She researched how delayed check processing affected people's ability to pay bills on time. How many faced late fees because their money wasn't available when promised? How emotional distress from these experiences led people to avoid banks altogether. By morning, she had calculated that discriminatory banking practices cost affected communities millions of dollars annually in direct and indirect losses. She emailed her findings to Dr. Patel, who responded immediately. "We need to take this public. And I know someone who can help." 2 days later, Lynn found herself in a small community center meeting room with Dr. Patel and a man introduced as Jin, a former bank compliance officer. "I tried to fix things from the inside for years," Jin explained, examining Lynn's data. "But every time I raised these issues, management would say there wasn't enough evidence of a systematic problem." He looked up at Lynn with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, they can't say that anymore, can they?" Together, they'd formed a plan. Dr. Patel would connect them with community organizations across the city. Jin would use his industry knowledge to identify which banking regulations were being violated, and Lynn would continue gathering and analyzing data. "We need more first-hand accounts," Lynn said. "People who are willing to share their stories publicly." "That's going to be the hardest part," Jin warned. "Nobody wants to admit they've been humiliated." Lynn thought about this. What if we create an anonymous survey? Something simple that people can fill out online or on paper. Over the next week, they created a survey asking about banking experiences. Dr. Patel distributed it through community centers, houses of worship, and neighborhood groups. Jin translated it into 3 additional languages. They received over 400 responses in just 10 days. Lynn spent a weekend organizing the new data. The results were even more stark than her initial findings. Not only were certain groups consistently treated differently, but the problem was worse at certain banks and branches than others. First National Bank, where Lynn had been humiliated, was among the worst offenders. "We have enough to approach the bank directly," Jin suggested during their next meeting. Lynn shook her head. "Not yet. Remember what you said about trying to change things from the inside? We need to build more pressure first." She pulled out a notebook filled with calculations. "Look at this. When people leave a bank due to poor treatment, they tell an average of 14 other people about their experience. Each of those people influences 2 to 3 others. The financial impact on banks is huge. They just don't connect it to their discriminatory practices." Dr. Patel smiled slowly. "You're saying we need to make that connection obvious for them?" "Exactly," Lynn replied. "We need to show them this isn't just a moral issue, it's hurting their bottom line." As she rode the bus home that evening, Lynn looked at her reflection in the window. Just weeks ago, she had been standing at that bank counter, cheeks burning with humiliation as people stared. Now she was leading a movement that might change how thousands of people were treated. Her phone buzzed with a text from Dr. Patel, local news reporter interested in our findings. Available for interview tomorrow? Lynn took a deep breath. Going public would change everything. Her company might not approve. The bank might push back. But she thought about the hundreds of stories she'd read, people made to feel small and unworthy in places where they should have been respected customers. Yes, she texted back. It's time people heard about this. As the bus continued down the darkening street, Lynn opened her laptop once more. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she had more data to analyze, more patterns to uncover. The numbers told a story that needed to be heard, and she was finally ready to tell it. Lynn stared at her reflection in the bathroom mirror, adjusting her collar for the 5th time. In 30 minutes, she would be on camera, telling her story to a news reporter. Her stomach twisted with nerves. You can do this, she whispered to herself, not just for you, for everyone who's been through this. The local news station had set up in a small coffee shop. The reporter, a woman named Tia with kind eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, motioned Lynn to sit across from her. We'll start with your experience, Tia explained, then move to what you've discovered since. Just speak naturally, like you're telling a friend what happened. The camera light blinked on, and Lynn took a deep breath. She described that day at the bank, the loud questioning, the stares, the long wait, while others were served quickly. Her voice shook at first, then grew stronger. After it happened, I discovered hundreds of similar stories, Lynn continued, pulling out her tablet to show the data she'd gathered. This isn't about one bad employee or one bad day. It's a pattern that affects thousands of people. When the interview aired that evening, Lynn watched from her apartment, fingers crossed tightly in her lap. The story ran for 4 minutes, an eternity in TV news time. By morning, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. The station's been flooded with calls, Tia told her. People wanting to share their own banking stories. We're thinking of doing a follow-up segment. But not all the responses were positive. First National Bank released a statement claiming they treated all customers equally and followed standard industry practices. They suggested Lynn's experience was an isolated incident. That afternoon, Lynn's boss called her into his office. The marketing team saw you on the news, he said, his expression unreadable. Lynn's heart sank. Was she in trouble? I've got the bank's PR director on the phone, he continued. They want to talk to you, privately. Lynn straightened her shoulders. I'd be happy to talk with them, but not privately. And I'd like Dr. Patel from the Financial Rights Coalition to join the call. Her boss raised an eyebrow, but nodded slowly. Fair enough. The call was set for the next day. That evening, Lynn, Dr. Patel, and Jin gathered to prepare. They'll try to minimize this, Jin warned. They'll offer you something small, a personal apology, maybe better treatment at your branch, in exchange for dropping the whole thing. Lynn shook her head. This isn't about me anymore. The next morning, Lynn sat in her boss's conference room, phone on speaker in the center of the table. Dr. Patel sat beside her, notepad ready. The bank's PR director spoke first. Ms. Chen, we'd like to express our sincere regret for your experience. We're preparing a formal apology and would like to offer you personalized banking services going forward. Thank you, Lynn replied calmly, but I'm not looking for special treatment. I'm asking for fair treatment for everyone. We assure you, our policies. I have data showing otherwise, Lynn interrupted. 472 documented cases of discriminatory practices at your bank alone. Would you like me to email you the spreadsheet? There was a long pause. Perhaps we should meet in person, the PR director finally said. This sounds more complex than we initially understood. 1 week later, Lynn, Dr. Patel, and Jin walked into First National Bank's downtown headquarters. The meeting room was intimidating, all glass and steel, with the bank's executives lined up on one side of a massive table. Lynn had expected to feel small in this room. Instead, she felt remarkably calm as she connected her laptop to the projector. Before I show you our findings, she began, I want to introduce some people. The door opened and 5 people walked in, all customers who had experienced similar treatment at various branches. An elderly Vietnamese man, a young black woman with a baby, a Latino small business owner, a college student, a middle-aged woman wearing a hijab. These are just a few of the people who've come forward, Lynn explained. They've agreed to speak with you directly about their experiences. For the next hour, each person told their story. Some spoke angrily, others through tears. Lynn watched the executives' faces change, from defensive to uncomfortable to genuinely concerned. When the last person finished speaking, the room fell silent. Now, Lynn said softly, turning to her data, let me show you the numbers. She walked them through everything, the patterns of treatment, the economic impact on customers, the business costs to the bank itself. Dr. Patel explained the legal implications under consumer protection laws. Jin outlined specific policy changes that could address the problems. As they finished, the bank's CEO leaned forward. What exactly are you asking us to do? She asked, her voice careful but not dismissive. Lynn had been waiting for this question. We've prepared a detailed proposal, new training programs, clear, consistent verification protocols, mystery shopper audits to test fair treatment, and a community advisory board with real power to oversee changes. She handed out folders containing their proposal. This isn't just about avoiding bad publicity, it's about better banking for everyone, including your bottom line. The CEO studied the documents, then looked up at Lynn. This would be a significant undertaking. Yes, Lynn agreed, but not as significant as the class action lawsuit that's likely to come if nothing changes. As they left the building an hour later, Dr. Patel squeezed Lynn's arm. They're actually considering it. I never thought we'd get this far. Lynn nodded, watching the city rush by around them. The fear she'd felt walking into that bank weeks ago had transformed into something powerful, something that might actually change things. Her phone buzzed with a message from Tia. 3 more banks willing to talk. How soon can you meet them? Lynn smiled as she typed her reply. This was just the beginning. 3 weeks passed with no word from First National Bank. Lynn tried to stay positive, but doubt crept in. Maybe the meeting had just been for show. Maybe nothing would change after all. They're stalling, Jin said during their weekly meeting at Dr. Patel's office. I've seen this before. They hope we'll lose interest or run out of energy. Dr. Patel nodded. It's a common tactic. Meanwhile, we've got 2 more community organizations wanting to join our coalition and 37 new reports of discriminatory treatment. Lynn stared out the window. Rain tapped against the glass, matching her mood. We need to keep the pressure on, but smart pressure, not just noise. That evening, Lynn couldn't sleep. Around midnight, she got up and opened her laptop. If the bank wouldn't respond, maybe it was time to approach things differently. She began researching the bank's competitors. How did they handle similar situations? Were any of them doing better? By morning, she had made an interesting discovery. A smaller regional bank had recently won a customer service award specifically for their inclusive practices. We need to meet with them, she told Dr. Patel the next day. Find out what they're doing right. The meeting was set for the following week. In the meantime, Lynn received an unexpected message from a woman named V, who worked in First National's HR department. I saw your interview, the message read. I'm not supposed to talk to you, but you should know they're discussing your proposal. Some executives want to implement changes. Others are worried about costs and liability if they admit there was a problem. Lynn thanked her for the information. Is there anything that would help convince the hesitant ones? She asked. Honestly, if other banks start changing first, they'll be afraid of being left behind. This gave Lynn an idea. At their meeting with the regional bank, rather than just gathering information, she proposed a partnership. Your bank is already doing much of what we're advocating for, she explained to their customer experience director. What if you became the public face of this movement? You could position yourselves as industry leaders. The director looked intrigued. What exactly would that involve? A public commitment to the standards we've outlined. Maybe a joint press conference with our coalition. You'd get positive publicity, and we'd get a concrete example to show other banks. 2 days later, the regional bank agreed. They would announce new customer service guarantees based on Lynn's coalition's recommendations. The press conference was scheduled for the following Monday. When news of the planned announcement reached First National, their response was swift. The CEO herself called Lynn. I understand you're working with City Trust Bank, she said, trying to sound casual but not quite succeeding. Yes, Lynn replied. They've been very receptive to our proposals. We've been reviewing your recommendations as well, the CEO continued. We'd like to discuss implementing some of them. How's tomorrow morning? Lynn covered the phone and silently pumped her fist in victory before responding. Tomorrow works. Our whole team will be there. The meeting the next morning had a very different tone from their first encounter. Gone was the wall of defensive executives. Instead, just the CEO, the head of operations, and the chief of staff sat across from Lynn, Dr. Patel, and Jin. We've reviewed your proposal carefully, the CEO began. Some changes would be easier to implement than others, but we agree with the general direction. Lynn listened carefully as they went through the document point by point. The bank was willing to adopt new training programs and clearer verification protocols. They were hesitant about the Community Advisory Board, but open to quarterly review meetings with community representatives. What about the mystery shopper audits? Lynn asked. This had been one of their key recommendations, having people from different backgrounds attempt the same transactions to test for bias. The operations head shifted uncomfortably. We have concerns about the methodology and reliability. Dr. Patel leaned forward. City Trust is implementing them next month. They see it as a valuable feedback mechanism. The CEO and operations head exchanged glances. We could perhaps run a pilot program, the CEO offered. By the end of the meeting, they had agreement on about 70% of the proposals. Lynn knew it wasn't everything they'd asked for, but it was a solid start. As they were gathering their things to leave, the CEO approached Lynn privately. I want you to know, she said quietly, that I was embarrassed by how you were treated in our branch. It shouldn't have happened. Lynn met her eyes. It shouldn't happen to anyone. Agreed, the CEO nodded. Which is why I'd like to offer you a consulting position to help us implement these changes. We need someone who understands both the data and the human impact. Lynn was speechless. This was unexpected. You don't have to answer now, the CEO continued. Think about it. We could use someone with your perspective. Outside, Dr. Patel and Jin were waiting. What did she say to you? Dr. Patel asked. Lynn told them about the job offer. That's complicated, Jin said slowly. Would you be co-opted, or could you push for more change from inside? Lynn shook her head. I honestly don't know. As they walked to the bus stop, Lynn thought about everything that had happened since that humiliating day at the bank. She had never imagined standing up to powerful institutions, never thought she could help create real change. Her phone buzzed with a news alert. City Trust Bank was promoting their new customer service guarantees, specifically mentioning fair treatment regardless of background. It's actually happening, she said softly. Dr. Patel smiled. This is just the beginning. If 2 banks can change, why not 10? Why not all of them? Lynn looked up at the bank buildings towering over them, no longer feeling small in their shadows. Whatever she decided about the job offer, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done changing the rules. Lynn stared at the job offer letter on her kitchen table. The salary was nearly double what she currently made. The title, the Director of Customer Experience Equity, was impressive. The opportunity to change things from the inside was tempting. I still don't know what to do, she told Dr. Patel over the phone. If I take the job, people might think I sold out. If I don't, I might miss a chance to make real change happen. What does your gut tell you? Dr. Patel asked. Lynn thought about it. That I need more information. The next day, she requested a meeting with the CEO to ask some tough questions. To her surprise, the CEO agreed to meet at a coffee shop rather than the bank's headquarters, neutral ground. I appreciate your candor, the CEO said after Lynn had asked about decision-making power, budget authority, and reporting structure for the new position. Most people would have just taken money. I'm not interested in a job where I'm just for show, Lynn replied. If I do this, I need to know I can actually make a difference. The CEO nodded slowly. Fair enough. How about this, a 6-month trial period? You keep your connection to the coalition. If you feel you're not able to create meaningful change, you walk away, no hard feelings. It was a better offer than Lynn had expected. Still, she asked for a few days to think about it. That weekend, she met with Jin at a small park. Children played on swings while they sat on a bench, discussing her options. The banks are being clever, Jin warned. They've realized they can't ignore us, so they're trying to control us instead. First they hire you. Then they watered down the changes until they're meaningless. Or, Lin countered, they've genuinely realized they need to change, and they want someone who understands the problem to help them do it right. And which do you think is more likely? Jin asked, raising an eyebrow. Lin sighed. I don't know, but I do know that change happens in different ways. Sometimes you need people pushing from the outside and people working from the inside. As they talked, Lin noticed a woman at the park watching them. After a while, the woman approached. Excuse me, she said hesitantly. Are you the woman from the news? The one talking about banks treating people unfairly? Lin nodded cautiously. I just wanted to say thank you, the woman continued. I've been embarrassed for years about how I'm treated at my bank. I thought it was just me, that maybe I was doing something wrong. After your story, I finally spoke up to the manager. What happened? Lin asked. He apologized, said they were changing their policies because of some new program. The woman smiled. I didn't feel small for the first time in years. After the woman left, Lin was quiet for a long time. I think I know what I need to do, she finally said. On Monday morning, Lin walked into First National Bank headquarters with a counter offer. She would accept the position, but with conditions. She would maintain her independence to speak publicly about banking practices, the Community Advisory Board would be fully implemented, and her performance metrics would be tied to measurable improvements in customer treatment across all demographics. To her surprise, the CEO accepted. You drive a hard bargain, she said with a small smile. But that's why we want you. Lin's first weeks in the new job were challenging. Some bank employees resented her, seeing her as an outsider who had criticized them. Others were enthusiastic but didn't understand the real problems. Most were simply wary, waiting to see if this was just another corporate PR move. She started with small, visible changes, clear signs explaining verification procedures in multiple languages, private areas where customers could discuss sensitive matters without the whole bank hearing, training sessions where employees practiced handling different scenarios with respect and consistency. The resistance came, as Jin had predicted, but not from where Lin had expected. It wasn't the frontline staff who pushed back hardest, it was middle management. These new procedures are slowing down our processing times, one branch manager complained during a meeting. My performance metrics are suffering. Then maybe we need to change the metrics, Lin replied calmly. What if we measured customer satisfaction and retention as highly as processing speed? The pushback continued, sometimes in subtle ways. Meeting invitations accidentally not sent to her. Important decisions made when she was out of the office. Budget requests for training programs mysteriously delayed. After one particularly frustrating day, Lin found herself back at the branch where she'd been humiliated months before. She hadn't planned to go there, her feet had just carried her automatically. The branch looked the same, but something felt different. The tellers spoke more quietly with customers. The signs were clearer. A new private consultation area had been set up in the corner. A young teller approached her. Can I help you? Lin shook her head, just looking around. I'm Lin Chen from the main office. The teller's eyes widened in recognition. Oh, you're the one who's changing everything. Some of the old-timers complain, but I think it's great. Last week I had a customer who barely spoke English, and I was able to use the new translation cards instead of making him feel bad. It was a small victory, but it felt significant. That evening, Lin called a meeting with Dr. Patel, Jin, and other coalition members. They gathered in the community center where it had all started. It's not going as quickly as I'd hoped, Lin admitted. There's still resistance. But there's progress too. Dr. Patel nodded. Meanwhile, our coalition has grown. 3 more banks have approached us about implementing similar changes. And our community reporting system has logged over 1,000 new cases, Jin added. People are speaking up now that they know they're not alone. Lin thought about the woman in the park, about the young teller who appreciated the changes. Small ripples that might eventually become waves. We need to keep pushing, she said firmly. Both from the inside and the outside. This isn't going to be fixed in weeks or months. No, Dr. Patel agreed. but for the first time, I believe it might actually be fixed." As the meeting continued, Lynn felt a quiet determination replace her earlier frustration. The path forward wouldn't be straight or easy. There would be setbacks and disappointments along with victories, but they had already come further than anyone had expected, and they were just getting started. 1 year had passed since that humiliating day at the bank. Lynn walked through the front doors of First National's main branch, no longer as a customer, but as the bank's Director of Customer Experience Equity. Employees nodded in greeting, some smiling, others still a bit wary. She was there for the unveiling of something she had fought for months to create. A customer bill of rights, prominently displayed in the lobby. The large sign listed clear expectations for how all customers would be treated, verification procedures that would be applied consistently, and ways to report problems if they occurred. "Do you think it will make a difference?" asked Mai, one of the tellers who had become a strong supporter of Lynn's efforts. "It already has," Lynn replied. "Look around." The branch looked different than it had a year ago. Private consultation areas with sound barriers allowed customers to discuss sensitive financial matters without being overheard. Signs in 5 languages explained common banking procedures. A digital feedback station stood near the exit, allowing customers to rate their experience before leaving. But the most important changes weren't visible. They were in the training programs, the revised policies, the new metrics that measured fair treatment alongside efficiency. They were in the quarterly audits that sent people from different backgrounds to conduct identical transactions and compare their experiences. Lynn checked her watch. The press will be here soon. Is everything ready for the announcement? Today, First National would be publicly joining the Fair Banking Standards Coalition, along with 12 other banks that had committed to the guidelines Lynn's team had developed. What had started as her personal humiliation had grown into a movement that was changing how financial institutions operated across the city. As Lynn straightened the display, an elderly man approached her hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you in charge here?" Lynn smiled. "I help with customer experience. Can I assist you with something?" The man nodded. "I need to cash this check from my pension. Last time I came, they made me feel like I was trying to rob the place." His hands trembled slightly as he held out the check. "I'm sorry that happened," Lynn said. "Would you mind if I walk with you to the counter? I'd like to see how things go today." Together, they approached a teller. Lynn didn't introduce herself as a manager, just stood quietly as the man presented his check and ID. The teller followed the new protocol exactly, polite, efficient, and respectful. The man was in and out in less than 5 minutes. As he turned to leave, he shook Lynn's hand. "That was different," he said, surprise in his voice. "Nobody questioned me. Nobody made me feel small." "That's how it should be," Lynn replied. "For everyone, every time." After he left, Lynn's phone buzzed with a message from Dr. Patel. "Turn on Channel 5 News now." Lynn hurried to the break room where a TV was mounted on the wall. A reporter was standing outside another bank, National Trust, one of their largest competitors. In a surprise announcement today, the reporter was saying National Trust Bank has revealed new customer service standards that they claim will revolutionize banking for all communities. This follows similar changes at several other financial institutions in recent months. Lynn couldn't help but smile. They hadn't even approached National Trust yet. The changes were spreading on their own as banks recognized that treating people fairly was also good business. Her phone rang. It was Jin. "Are you seeing this?" he asked. "They're copying our whole program." "Good," Lynn replied. "That was always the goal, not just to change one bank, but to change banking." Later that afternoon, as reporters gathered for First National's announcement, Lynn stood slightly behind the CEO, content to let others take the spotlight. Her boss had suggested she speak, but Lynn preferred to watch from the sidelines. The CEO acknowledged the coalition's work and announced the bank's formal commitment to the fair banking standards. She detailed the changes already made and those still to come. Reporters asked tough questions about past practices and how the bank would ensure consistent improvement. As the press conference ended, a reporter from the local newspaper approached Lynn directly. "You're the one who started all this, right? After you were humiliated at a branch last year." Lynn nodded cautiously. "What made you decide to work for the very bank that treated you badly?" The reporter pressed. Lynn thought carefully before answering. Sometimes you need to change things from the inside, and sometimes people and institutions deserve a second chance to do better. That evening, Lynn met with the coalition at their usual community center. The room was packed. Their small group had grown to include representatives from neighborhood associations, small business alliances, and even other banks. Dr. Patel gave updates on their progress. Complaints of discriminatory treatment down 62% at participating banks. Customer satisfaction scores up across all demographic groups. 3 banks that had initially refused to engage now requesting meetings. And the State Banking Commission has contacted us, Dr. Patel added. They want to discuss incorporating our standards into their regulatory guidelines. Lynn listened with a sense of amazement. A year ago, she had been one humiliated customer with a spreadsheet and a burning sense of injustice. Now she was part of something that was changing an entire industry. We still have so much work to do, Jin reminded everyone. Most banks outside the city haven't made any changes. Rural areas are being completely left out. And we're only addressing one type of financial discrimination. You're right, Lynn agreed. But look at what we've already done. If we can change banking, what else can we change? Insurance companies, housing, lending. The room buzzed with energy as people began suggesting new targets, new coalitions, new possibilities. As the meeting wrapped up, Lynn found herself standing near the window, looking out at the city lights. A year ago, she had felt small and powerless against huge institutions. Now she understood that change didn't require you to be big, it required you to be persistent, strategic, and willing to work with others. Dr. Patel joined her at the window. What are you thinking about? Lynn smiled. About how sometimes the worst moments in our lives can lead to the best things we'll ever do. Outside, the city stretched before them, filled with systems and institutions that still needed changing. For the first time, those systems didn't seem unmovable. They just needed the right people with the right data and the right determination to push in the right places. And Lynn was just getting started.